All right, what's up, y'all? Thanks for coming out. Welcome to all of our locations. Thank you for joining us this morning, right? Still a little bit of morning. Thanks for coming out. I'm Jarrod. I have the joy of getting to be the senior pastor of Grace, these wonderful people. Special welcome again to our guests and also all our locations coming to you live right now. Thank you again for joining us. We're in a series called The Story of God. Just a big series, and we're doing little mini-series underneath it where we're just seeing books of the Bible reveal who God is in all His glory and revealing who we are in His presence, and also seeing how God presents us with the big questions of life, such as who am I, why am I here, what's my purpose, where do I find meaning, what should be most important and top priority of my life. All of that and the answers are coming with it. So we're in this mini-series called Trials and Trust, and we'll be landing that today. And the next week, I just want to share a special message from my heart, so I hope you'll come back for that, and then we'll kick back in with the series. So getting into where we're headed this morning, so my kids, we have Jubilee, who is 9. She'll be 10 in December. We have Marnie, who is 15. We have Josiah, who is 14. We have Titus, who is 13. I always get really nervous when I start naming my kids and their ages. I'm so afraid I'm going to blank out, but I did it. Okay, so when the older kids were younger, around 7, 8 years old, I made a deal with them. So we're a basketball-oriented kind of family. I was a basketball player in college and so forth. So I told them, if you ever beat me one-on-one in basketball, I will pen you a check for $500. Now they're 14 and 15. Pray for your pastor. We do not have that in the budget. So, and they always want to play me after I mow the lawn. So what happens is when we start playing, if they start winning, what I do, I'm 6'7", 250. They are not. So I just put my rear end in them and I back them down all the way under the goal, and I just do my little layup. And I win the game. And I'll joke with them too. I'm going, the tables have turned. Goodbye, $500. The tables have turned. I want you to think about that quote right there. The tables have turned. The tables have turned. The tables have turned. Anybody need the tables to be turned somewhere in their life today? Do you believe God is a God who still moves mountains? You believe He'll do it again? Do you need the tables turned in your life, in your health, in your marriage, in your situation, in your circumstances, in your emotions? We're going to talk about how today God will turn the tables in your life as we see Him reveal Himself and opportunities there in the Book of Esther. Esther, powerful book. Let's take a glimpse at the Book of Esther. Let me break it down and we'll survey it together, and then we'll tie it into the 21st century and what this means for your life and mine tomorrow, and how the tables are turned. So first we meet King Xerxes. Xerxes is kind of a show-off in his power and his wealth. We'll meet him more in a moment. Then we'll meet, just very, very briefly, Vashti, his wife. By the way, they are the Persian king and the Persian queen. That is Vashti. Then we'll meet, also following, we will meet Mordecai. Mordecai is a Jewish man in Persia. Remember last week how a handful of the Jews were returning to their homeland, rebuilding Jerusalem and the temple and the walls and all of that. Mordecai was one of the many who did not return, so he's still in Persia. We'll also meet Esther. Esther is also a Persian woman who finds herself before the king of Persia, and we'll see more of that unfold too. And then finally, we meet the bad guy. He's the villain of the story. It's a historical, true story, and his name is Haman. Now, let me set it up a little bit. I'm going to go ahead and give the ending away, because you know how the ending is going to be. They're going to win. Just like when you went to see Avengers Endgame, you know we're going to win. If you watch Rocky, you know Rocky's going to win. If you watch Creed, you know he's going to win. We love the moment where it builds and things get worse and worse and worse, and then what happens? The tables are turned, right? And then there's the win. Well, we know the win ultimately is that the Jews will be saved. So what happens is Haman brings a threat to the Jewish people of that day. He's threatening to commit the first Holocaust. He wants to commit genocide to the entire Jewish population, and we'll see how that happens in just a moment. Well, the ending is they are redeemed. If they were not redeemed and saved and rescued, there would be no Jesus. So they are saved. And in that day, toward the end of Esther, you'll see that there was this feast, this festival called the Festival of Purim that they birthed and that has continued to this day. Purim means, think of it as dice. And what Haman did in thinking how he would commit genocide against the Jewish people, on the date he would do it, he rolled the dice on a calendar, the Purim, and whatever date the dice fell on was the date they would be annihilated. And that all happened, but they were rescued, they were saved. And so thus came this Festival of Purim, or Feast of Purim, that is celebrated even to this day about their deliverance. So the Jewish people, when they get to that date on the calendar, they throw parties, they dress up in costumes, they dance, they shout, they celebrate. Matter of fact, at the end of this message, we're gonna celebrate God in a way we don't do much around here, so be prepared for that. Also, they read the Book of Esther, and they sometimes put plays on regarding the Book of Esther. And every time they mention the name Haman, they all go, boo. So I want you to join me in the story here for a little while. I'm going to invite you to join me. Whenever you hear Haman's name, boo, that's right. Right, jumping the gun a little bit right there, all right? So let's try it again. Haman. Haman. Ham bone. Oh, you did it. You did it. You're like one of the only services that did it. Okay, let's move on. So let's see how this story unfolds. Okay, so we meet Xerxes in chapter 1. He's the king of the Persian kingdom, very wealthy. He's a show-off. He's also a big drinker, and he gets drunk, and he throws this 187-day kegger. You know, everybody flocks to free alcohol, and that's what they did, this big party. And he gathered his royal people around him, and in his drunken stupor, he wants to show off his wife, Vashti. So he calls for her to unrobe herself, put on her crown, and parade herself around everyone. And her response was, not going to happen. And he flew into a drunken rage and pretty much kicked her out of the kingdom. She is no longer the queen. He sobers up the next day and regrets what he did, and his royal people around him said, well, here's what you can do, king. Why don't you call for all the virgins in the Persian Empire, all the women, to come together into a harem and put on a Persian beauty pageant, and out of that beauty pageant, you can choose a new queen. And just by coincidence, Esther happened to be caught up in that harem and brought before the king. And just by coincidence, she caught his eye. And she ended up winning the beauty pageant and becoming his queen. This Jewish girl, a queen, although he didn't know she was Jewish, not at this point. At the same time, her uncle Mordecai is at the palace gates, and he overhears a couple of royal guards planning to assassinate King Xerxes. Mordecai overhears this. Just by coincidence, he happened to be there. Just by coincidence, he happened to hear the conversation. So he goes to Esther, and he tells her of the plot. Esther tells the king, and the plot is done away with. So the king is so overwhelmed with joy about this, he gets Mordecai's name, and Mordecai's name is written down and what he did in these chronicles, these records of the kings, and then kind of put on the shelf with all the hundreds of others there. Following that, Haman walked out of the gates one day because he has been made number 2 in the kingdom. There was kind of a government shakedown with Xerxes because there was these plots. So Haman, number 2, kind of feels his ego and pride in it all, walks out of the gates and calls for everyone to bow down before him. And everyone bowed down before him except Mordecai. Because Haman is an Amalekite. And if you followed the series at all, read the scriptures, the Amalekites were the chief enemies of the Jews, so he refused to bow. So Haman flies into a rage and declares that not only will Mordecai ultimately be executed, but he will annihilate, on top of that, all of the Jewish population. Mordecai hears of this news, and he begins to wail, and he begins to weep, and he begins to rip his clothes in terror and sadness and grief. And Mordecai goes to Esther, and he says, Esther, you have to do something. Who knows that God may have put you in this place for such a time as this? Even if you're not a Christian, maybe you've heard that quote before that's big in the church world, is that declaration, who knows that you may have been raised up for such a time as this. And so Esther is kind of adding it up, and what she knows is that not even the queen could just walk into the presence of this king. The king has to invite you into his presence. He has to hold out the scepter and invite you. And she knows if she kind of walks up in his space, she will be executed on the spot. So she's afraid of this. And he says, listen, if you don't step up and provide deliverance by going to the king, God's going to raise somebody else up to deliver us. So this is your moment. And she says, well, if I perish, I perish. Powerful. And it always reminds me that you got to risk it to get the biscuit. Okay, so she risks it, and it happens. She now calls for this banquet, one of the first banquets with the king and with Haman. Haman and the king get drunk again. Out he walks, Haman walks outside, he sees Mordecai, and again, in a drunken rage, he goes off again on Mordecai and builds these gallows that are 75 feet tall in which he wants to hang Mordecai. Well, Esther kind of has it at play what's going down, but little do we know what's happening with the king. Just by coincidence, the king can't sleep one night, and so he calls for his audiobook to be brought to him and read by a servant. So just by coincidence, out of all these chronicles, they pick the book, and just by coincidence, they flip through all the pages to the page with Mordecai's name. Just by coincidence. And he sees how his deliverance ultimately came through Mordecai, and he said, what am I doing? He needs to be celebrated. The next morning, though, Haman waltzes up into the king's presence, and the king says, you need to take Mordecai and parade him around all the people so that he can be celebrated. You call that the tables have been turned. So the tables were turned. Now, on the heels of that, Esther calls for another feast for it to be between her and then also Haman and the king. And it's right there that Esther reveals Haman and his plot toward her and Mordecai and the Jews. The king, very beside himself over this, walks out of the room. He walks back, and Haman has thrown himself on top of Esther, begging for his mercy. And of course, the king sees her and says, what are you doing on top of it all? You're hitting on my wife? And then he hangs Haman from the gallows. But there's still a problem. There was a decree that went out from the king back in Haman's moment to wipe out the Jews, and you could not reverse a decree of the king. So the king then, with the help, I believe, of Mordecai, issues another decree that the Jews could defend themselves against any Persian attack with ruthlessness, with permission and the power of the king behind them. And then that's when we read in Esther chapter 9, verse 1, on this day the enemies of the Jews had hoped to overpower them, but now the tables were turned, and the Jews got the upper hand over those who hated them. Anybody need the upper hand in a situation in your life? Anybody need the tables to turn in your life? By the way, no more booing with Haman. All right, let's end it right there. All right, everybody, all our campuses, no more because you'll throw me off and I'll get lost. Okay, so we'll leave it at that. So I've really wrestled with how I wanted to word this. So there was this part of me that wanted to come out and say, God can turn the tables in your life. He can turn the tables. But you know what? I believe you know that already. So I want to step up and go this far with you. The Lord has turned the tables in your life today. He has turned the tables in your life today. Now, how can you step into the hope that this is going to unfold in your life, this turning of the table? I see this in a few ways in the book of Esther. And here's the first thing you got to believe. Believe God works wonders with the worst. Believe God works wonders with the worst. We are people of flaws. I have flaws. I get therapy, all that, all right? We have flaws. We have sinful bents. We also have failures in our lives that we regret, that haunt us. We also have foolishness in our lives. We do dumb things. We say dumb things, and we know better. Most of the time, we know better, but still, there's just this something in us, this foolishness bent that we have, and we just create a bad environment around us. Or perhaps the worst, maybe you've done something and you're reflecting on it now, and it could have been something you did decades ago, and you just go, boy, that was the worst. It's the worst thing I ever did. I'm still not over what I did. I'm not even sure I'm forgiven. Or maybe the worst has been done to you. That's terrible. It's the worst, and you're not finding victory over it, or you're not even finding victory with it. Or maybe you're just in an environment that's just the worst. It could be a work environment. It could be your family environment. I don't know what that looks like for you. But in it all, I want you to believe something with me today. Believe that God can work wonders with your worst. So let's look at Esther and Mordecai, for example. First of all, here's something to consider, that Esther and Mordecai were swept up in circumstances outside of their control. So, for example, we find Esther as an orphan. Her mom and dad passed away. I don't know how they passed away. I don't know if they were murdered or just died of old age. I don't know. But the thought of your mother and father dying is the worst, no matter how old you are. That's the worst. And not to have family, she's an orphan, that's the worst. All of that is outside of her control. Then you find Mordecai. Mordecai was taken from Jerusalem and brought to Babylon, the Persian Empire. He didn't ask for that. He didn't want to be ripped away from his home. All of this is circumstances outside of their control. Or right now, is anybody in circumstances outside of your control? And you're looking at your circumstances, maybe in a way you're scratching your head and you're going, how did I even get here? What did I do to end up here? What happened here? And it's outside of your control. And maybe it feels bad, or maybe it feels like it's the worst. You don't even know where to go from here. Or how about this? Esther and Mordecai, it looked like they were basically outside of God's will. Because remember from last week, there was a permission given and a call given for the people of God to leave their Babylon and Persia and go home to their homeland and rebuild their lives and rebuild their careers and rebuild their community and rebuild the temple that represented God's presence. Why didn't Esther and Mordecai go? Looks like they're outside of God's will. And on top of it, look what all happened to them. If they'd have just went home, if they just would have obeyed God's will, they wouldn't have been under all that threat, all that damage in their lives. How about you? Do you feel outside of God's will? Do you feel, even worse, do you feel locked outside of God's will? That you've compromised, that you've sinned, and you're in a space now and in a relationship now, you don't see any way out, and you believe God's just kind of let you go. Or how about this? If you read Esther, it's really intriguing reading because it's a story full of drunkenness, full of sexual immorality, full of greed, murder. And Mordecai and Esther find themselves right in the middle of it all. I mean, Esther was no saint, and Mordecai was no saint. First of all, Esther didn't resist being swept up into this harem. She didn't resist immorality with the king, like Vashti, in a sense, did, who was a Persian queen. She also ate the food and drank the wine of the king. That was a no-no. That was sin in that day. If you know of the book of Daniel in the Old Testament, one of the stances young Daniel took was he refused to eat the food or drink the wine of the king because it was a direct breaking of a commandment. We don't see Esther standing in anything. So there's these unwise choices, sinful choices made. And then Mordecai, we can't let him off the hook either. So you read Esther chapter 1, chapter 2, it says Mordecai, after Esther had been taken up into the kingdom with Xerxes, it says that he was outside the gates and he would check on Esther and ask how she was doing. Now, I always read that in a sense that he was just this compassionate uncle caring for Esther. And I believe he was to a degree, but there's also this bent, if you take the whole story in context, that he wanted to know the angles Esther was playing for his benefit. What good was this manipulation maybe that was going to work out in his favor. So you can say they were in places of compromise even, in a lifestyle not of God. So were they too far gone? Or can God work wonders with the worst. So let me ask you again, do you feel like you're in difficult circumstances outside of your control? Do you feel like you've been locked out of God's will due to the choices that you have made? Do you feel like you've been given opportunities and you've wasted them and you don't see any way out of that as well? Do you find yourself in hardships due to past choices as well, that it's just the worst and you don't see any way out? Can I just say today the tables have turned? The tables have turned. Just believe. Believe that God can work wonders with the worst. How about this? The tables have turned. If you'll trust God is never absent, only anonymous. He's never absent, only anonymous. So if you read the Book of Esther, there's something that to pay attention to, and it's that God is never mentioned in the entire book. Not once. If you read the story just at face value, it even seems that God isn't even needed in the story because it just kind of happens naturally as it unfolds. Except for the coincidences. There's a lot of coincidences. I don't know if you heard it as we heard the story unfold, a lot of coincidences. Do you recognize coincidences in your life? Do you recognize them today? Can you look back on the past? Ever said, wow, what a coincidence. Wow, did you see, that was an amazing coincidence. You know how someone defined coincidences? Coincidences are God's way of remaining anonymous. God is at work within even the coincidences. So wherever you are, trust that God is behind the scenes and at work stringing things together for you. He's involved. He hasn't wound up the world and just let it go and hope we make out all right. But he's directly involved behind the scenes. He sees you with affection and care and working things together for the good of those who love him. I was at the Price Chopper in Warwick last week. Ever been to the Price Chopper in Warwick? It's fantastic. I've never been there. So, what a place. So I went in there to get a prescription filled, and so we need about 5 or 10 minutes. I was cool with it because I wanted to tour the Price Chopper. It's really nice. And so I've been trying to eat a little better. I've been trying to watch my diet and so forth. So I've been reading, so you need more fish in your life. Get more fish in your life. So I went to the fish section. Fish is not cheap, but I'm checking it out. Salmon and all this cod and whatever. I get this text from my wife, Christy. And on the text, she says this. She goes, I see you in the fish section. Remember, we're on a budget. So I'm a little freaked out for a moment. Well, we have this app called Life 360. And literally the app tells everybody where you are, how far away you are, and how fast you drove to get there. And for some way, Christy put on some GPS, and there was this blue circle around where I was in Price Chopper in the fish section. She said, you're in the fish. You know what I wrote and told her? I wrote her back and said, well, at least I'm not in the beer section. Yeah. So if there's love and affection in looking upon me with a GPS, how much more is God involved and seen and working in your life in ways you can't even fathom? Sometimes it could even be a little freaky, a little creepy. Wow, God's so close. This coincidence. It's not a coincidence. He's anonymous. Wow, look, he's real, and this is unfolding in my life. You know what? God is stringing coincidences together for you by the thousands that you don't even recognize. Think of the king. Let me just use that. There are several coincidences throughout the book of Esther, but how about this one? The king just by coincidence couldn't sleep that night. And the king just by coincidence decided he wanted to have one of the books read to him. And just by coincidence, whoever chose the book, out of probably dozens, if not hundreds, they chose that book. And just by coincidence, when they flip through all those pages, just by coincidence, they land on the page with Mordecai. Wow. So God is the hero at work behind the stories. So I was trying to think of what's an example I could share with you of how I've seen God work in my life, maybe to get you thinking about your own life. I've told the story about how Grace Community Church and I connected, what coincidences that led into, and then how Christy and I met. You know, I'm this kind of a redneck from Alabama. She's this beauty in Connecticut, and only God could string together coincidences for us to meet. And I've been there already. But I was thinking of this. So I don't know if you guys know, I've written a couple of books. They've been out a while, from the early 2000s, and one of them is, this is one of them here, called The Backward Life. So matter of fact, this girl, the girl's name, it was used, by the way, and her name's Jennifer, and she's from Kentucky, and all this stuff. So yeah, so when the book came out, it flew off the shelves by the twos, okay? By the twos, and then I realized they were all bought by my mom and dad. So I'm grateful for them buying boxes and giving them away. So anyway, I got this call from a friend, and he said, hey, there's this girl, and she's going through a hard time, and she's interested in spirituality and Jesus, and would you write a little note, send her a book? I said, man, I'm all in. So I sent it to her. A few months later, I get this email, and this girl was saying, oh, this book, I just love it, and it's really spoke to my heart, and I've grown closer to Jesus, and I would just cherish this book for the rest of my life. Y'all, this is the book. First of all, she put it on thriftbooks.com, made $3 on it, all right? And then somehow, think about this book, out of the thousands of people who can buy this book in all these other places, that book was bought and somehow ended up on my desk so God could crush my soul with humility, all right? Here it is. It's crazy. Okay, let me see if I can redeem it a little bit. I got this call from another guy from South Korea, probably around mid-2007, 2008, something like that. South Korea, mind you. So not a call, an email. So he emails me, and he invites me to come to South Korea and speak at his school. It's a Christian school, but not really a school of Christians. They had teenagers who were sons and daughters of diplomats and different religions. And anyway, and you know, I'm from Alabama. South Korea? That blew my mind that he actually wanted me to come there. And so I asked him, I said, I have a huge question. How in the world do you know me? Why are you inviting me? Here's what he said. He said, well, I was down in the whatever city of South Korea he was in. He said, I walked into this bookstore. It was by coincidence. And I'm just walking around the bookstore, and I'm just trying to take it in. And I walked into this section of the bookstore, and I just happened to be there, and I looked, and then I saw this book just kind of shine to me. And I picked it up, and the book was called The Backward Life. And I went back, and I read it, and I thought, wow, God wants this message to my students. And he said, that's why I'm reaching out. So he reached out. I flew over there, spoke for 3 days, and 12 students gave their lives to Jesus Christ right there in South Korea. Isn't that crazy? The hero of that story is our God. I mean, God strung coincidences together for that book that's barely even getting out of the internet. Ends up in South Korea. How does that even happen? And then he ends up in that bookstore, in that section, and for some reason it was my book that got his attention, and for some reason God wanted me to go there. It's all because God was at work. He was stringing things together for his glory, for my good, for others' joy. Know that God is doing that for you. That's why you can believe that God works wonders with the worst. That's why you can believe and trust that God's not absent in your life. He's just anonymous. Listen for him clearing his throat. That's the coincidences of your life. Are you paying attention? Are you paying attention? And when the coincidence showed up with Esther, she had to make the choice to step into the opportunity before her. So when God turns the tables, don't leave your turn on the table. Did you follow me? Don't table your turn, because that's part of stepping into God having turned the tables for you. Is you got to step through in faith. But I'm getting a little ahead of myself. Where are we? Believe God works wonders. Trust God's never absent, only anonymous, except you don't need a miracle for the amazing. Now, I'm like you. There are places in my life, circumstances I've been in, things I've worked through, and I've literally said out loud, God, it's going to take a miracle. Anybody said that recently? It's going to take a miracle for the tables to turn. Maybe not. Maybe not. maybe God wants to do a work in the mundane. God works mostly with the mundane, not the miracles. That's why you got to accept it. That's why you got to believe. That's why you have to trust. So again, the book of Esther makes sense without God. There are no miracles in Esther, just coincidences that unfold through the unfolding of the mundane type lives in the story. God's the hero doing all the work behind the scenes. That's why it's a marvel when you get to Esther 9:1. Now the tables were turned. Now the tables were turned, that the Jews had the upper hand. However, see, the issue you don't know is when the tables were turned, there were still 9 months to go with the Purim. The Purim landed on a date that was 9 months outside of that. 9 months. So for 9 months, see, God could have turned the tables right then. God could have done a miracle, reversed the decree, and all the threat go away overnight. God didn't do that. They had to sweat it for 9 months. They had to trust God's turning the tables for 9 months with all the threat under them. So he didn't do a miracle, but he worked in the grind. I want to remind you, God is in the grind. You got to be mindful. You got to watch for him. You got to listen for him and accept today. Maybe you just take a deep breath and go, okay, I've been pleading for a miracle. Maybe God, it's not by a coincidence that I'm here today, first of all, and that God wants me to hear this message today. And maybe the message, one of the messages God wants me to get is, I don't need a miracle. I just need to know he's at work in the mundane and that he's turning the tables. I wish he would turn the tables on my time frame, but I trust he turns the tables in a way that's for my joy, for his glory, and for others' good. Can you accept it? Trust him. Believe him. And then finally, oh, this is powerful. How could I forget this scripture? What do you do as you walk through the 9 months-ish? What do you do as you walk through the mundane for God to turn the tables? Here, trust in the Lord with all your heart and don't lean on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him and he will make your paths straight. Trust in the Lord, all your heart. Don't lean on your own understanding. Remember, our 3-pound gray matter here, God is infinite in his wisdom. We have thimbles. He's oceans. You can't fit oceans of wisdom into our thimbles. That's why you have to trust him and don't lean on your own understanding, but trust him and give your heart to him. So we lived in a house years ago over by Goshen. Those huge trees were there, and we had this one willow tree that was dying, and it threatened to fall on our house. So we bit the bullet, called someone to come out, hey, take care of this tree. And as they were preparing to cut the tree, I'm standing in the living room looking out the window going, this doesn't look right. What they're doing, I wouldn't do it this way. This looks dangerous, as if they're planning on it falling on our home. Christy would walk in, look out the window and go, I can't watch, I can't even look, I can't look. And the thing I kept repeating to myself was, I hope they know what they're doing. I wouldn't do it like that. I hope they know what they're doing. I hope they know what they're doing. And they did know what they were doing, and so does God. Amen. God knows what he's doing with your life. Now, you may be in a place going, I can't look, I can't look. When if you're in a place, I hope he knows what he's doing, because I wouldn't do it like that. God, I wouldn't do it like that in this situation. I wouldn't do it like that in my life. I hope you know what you're doing. Oh, he knows what he's doing. Because finally, he keeps his promises to keep you. He keeps his promises to keep you. Who knows how God is at work in your life? I don't know. Maybe you don't even know. I guarantee you this, he's got something up his sleeve. Romans 8:28, for God works all things together for the good of those who love him and are called according to his purpose. Oh, he's at work. I don't know how he's at work. I don't know what your deliverance is going to look like. I don't know if it's going to be in a moment today, or it's the tables have turned and it's going to work its way out 9 months from now, 9 years from now. I don't know, but trust your thimble, and he has oceans of wisdom. He's got you. He knows what he's doing. So Mordecai knew his Bible. See, that helps when you're walking through the worst, is to know the scriptures. What do you say to Esther? Esther, you don't risk it and be a part of how God's going to bring deliverance. God's going to deliver us with somebody else. So he took his trust out of Esther and put it in God, because he knew the scriptures. He knew the Bible. He knew all the way back in Genesis 3, God had promised that he would bless the nations through Abraham and preserve his people till kingdom come. He knew 2 Samuel 7, in a sense, where God promised David, there will never be a king outside of your bloodline off the throne, ultimately pointing to Christmas, which we see Jesus, King Jesus, the son of David. He knew God would not let go of his promise, and God has promised to keep you too. His promises are sure. Do you believe it? Do you believe it? His promises so sure that you can say today, the tables have turned. The tables have turned. You know how you can know especially how the tables have turned? His name is Jesus. I want you to stand up with me right now. Stand up with me. Do you believe right now God has turned the tables in your life? Come on, somebody. The Lord has turned the tables in your life. When Jesus went to the cross, it looked bad. Then he dies. It looked bad. He went into the grave. It couldn't get any worse. But on the third day, y'all, the tables turned. The tables turned. And God is turning the tables, I believe, for you right now. So you need to follow God. You need to risk it to get the biscuit. You need to step out of the grave into your resurrection. Trust that God is turning the tables on your health. Trust that God's turning the tables on your marriage. Trust that God's turning the tables on your heart. He's turning the tables from despair to joy, from sorrow to hope, from fear to courage. Somebody say the tables have turned. So God, may it be in this place that freedom is here and happening, that you are faithful to the end, Jesus. Praise your name. Amen.